Um, as Morris has just said, my name's Emmett Tuite and I'm a lecturer in the Institute of Technology in Blanchardstown, and I'm going to speak a little bit about the idea of turning stories into practice and using stories within social care settings as a method for a whole range of different things. Students consistently give me two pieces of feedback about my lecturing at the end of the year, and the first one is that I move around too much, so I'm going to try and stay up on this stage. They find it distracting when I wander around this room. And the second thing is that I speak too fast, and that's one I'm still working on addressing. So if you need me to slow down, feel free just to put up your hand and remind me of that, and I won't be in any way offended. In terms of storytelling, I suppose, it maybe presents an opportunity to talk about some of the concepts we looked at this morning. I'll try and link some of the material into the stuff that Mark spoke about in particular early on. I'm going to start with a brief quote from Truman Capote, who says, "A conversation is a dialogue, not a monologue. That's why there's so few good conversations. Due to scarcity, two intelligent talkers seldom meet." And I suppose it's a humorous way of starting off by thinking about how we listen to service users and the two-way process that's at work with regard to storytelling, both us using stories to educate and engage with service users, and service users using stories to communicate with us. And all of you who work with children and young people are familiar with the idea of the stories they construct and the extent to which they can get their message across really, really effectively using stories. So basically what we're going to look at, some current research in relation to storytelling. And when I mentioned Mark's presentation earlier, Mark focused quite a bit on the kind of interaction between theory and practice, and this idea of the kind of academic preserve of certain parts of information and then how it translates across into the real world of what we do on a day-to-day basis. And storytelling offers a real opportunity from that point of view. When I started looking at this material with Lavinia, one of the things I looked at was, is it just like too fluffy? You know, is there actually anything to it? Can you turn it into something that is legitimately a piece of research? Is there any theory out there on it? And surprisingly enough, there's quite a bit of theory out there, not from a social care point of view, but from lots of other perspectives about storytelling. I'm going to talk about the idea of using stories connect and stories in terms of relationship building, effectively how we do it, obstacles that get in the way of this happening, and there are lots of those out there, and a tool with regard to, briefly, I'm just going to look at social care education, because one part of our research looked at the idea of whether or not storytelling can be used within training and education to facilitate learning. This is a nice little quote to start with. What happens is of little significance compared with the stories we tell ourselves about what happened and how we process information. Events matter little, only stories of events affect us. So if you think about 2 or 3 different people's experience of a relatively similar situation, like an incident of challenging behaviour, and we talk to 2 or 3 staff members and talk to the young person involved, they have a very, very different story about that similar experience. And if you were involved in that, you'd have a different story again. So it's kind of about how we process information from that point of view is significant. Pick up a chair and get comfortable. These are some quotes from our research that link into the idea of storytelling. Wait till I tell you what happened. And we see this when we come on shift. You see this when you come into handover. You see this some point in a staff meeting where someone says, well, wait till I tell you what happened. And they want to run through the story of a particular incident rather than the technical detail. And maybe that touches on Mark's point earlier about how in some way or another technical detail isn't always that important, and for someone else it's more about telling their perspective on the event. Some historical stuff. People have always told stories to help them understand life dilemmas. Bettelheim has a lovely book written about this sort of stuff. The uses of enchantment. He writes about the significance of fairy tales in particular for children and how children use fairy tales to process information. They give us a deeper understanding of life and the emotions that accompany an experience. So again, through a story, we can see what a person picks up as being significant, what they drop and leave out of a particular story. The information that's maybe untold sometimes can be as significant as the information that's told. Children are really, really good at acting out stories. One of my own kids at the moment, he's decided that he's a police officer and he's going around the house arresting us left, right and centre every day. And you can see in his story, in his mind, he's absolutely embedded in this role. It's not something that's up for negotiation. He buys into the story in a really, really significant way. And it links closely to how humans articulate their experience of the world. Well, at a really basic level, we've always told stories. You know, people do this in a really natural way all the time across all cultures. Storytelling is pretty central. What is it in terms of definitions? A real or imagined account of events that describe an experience. And the imagined element of it is quite interesting. We presented a lot of this material at a conference in Scotland earlier on this year, and people had a lot of questions afterwards about what about untrue stories or stories which appear to lack some element of reality in them, and engaging with those. And lots of the research would suggest that stuff is equally important, and who are we to put like a structure on something to say, well, exactly what's legitimate in terms of an honest version of events versus some other version of events. And where children and young people are engaged in fantasy, that can be really, really important and can give us lots of learning too. Words and actions used to describe a sequence of events that capture the imagination of a listener. That's an important point on capturing the imagination. I do this in class. I'm talking about all my theoretical stuff, and I see people slowly begin to drift off into the Netherlands. And as I see them get more and more disconnected, all I have to do is say, one time this service user, and when I bring them back to that, and I'm going to tell you about something that happened. And particularly if I throw in challenging behaviour or something that's apparently quite engaging or trendy from their point of view, they all sit up and they start listening. So it's this idea of engaging our imagination, that if I'm going to tell you a story, this thing happened, I saw this, that's important. Can be oral, written, visual and digital. The only important point there is the idea of digital stories, and in that context there's loads and loads happening at the moment in research terms around digital stories and using digital stories online and the digital world. And we haven't really engaged with this in social care in general terms. We haven't really come to terms with understanding how exactly we can use this opportunity for learning, development and engagement in the most effective way. I just ask you to consider the role of storytelling in your own practice, and have you used it? And we'll talk a little bit about formal and informal storytelling, where we use formal stories in a structured manner, maybe within a staff team meeting, maybe within a debrief, maybe within a handover, and then the informal storytelling where a kid comes to you with some sort of an issue and you detail some experience you've had that you think might be able to help them process that. Some research from Scotland, influence and change at an individual practice and an organisational level. Lots of stuff from a training perspective about the idea of influencing organisational change through stories. And again, if you look at some of the stuff from a technological perspective, some of the organisations that are really effective around this, like Google, can use storytelling in a really, really useful manner. Facilitates better person-centred care. Well, the research suggests that actually it can give us a much more clearer view of someone's individual perspective. So it helps us to remain person-centred in keeping with what the literature says we should be doing at the moment. Greater understanding and reflection, and allows us to put something in context. A story from the past, or maybe even a story about something someone feels is going to happen in future, can be useful from that point of view. Builds this relationship rapport, this back and forth of me telling a story. And think about this in the social circles you mix with and your friendship groups. You have this pattern where you tell a story and then someone else tells a story that links to that, and then someone else tells about their experience of that particular story. Benefits the teller, as it can empower and encourage personal growth and build resilience, so it can help from both a practitioner and a service user point of view. And ethical issues and barriers come up all the time around this, and I'll touch on this. This was a big concern in the research we did in terms of practitioners talking about some of the risks and concerns they had about storytelling, particularly about unintentional disclosure, about information being misused in some way. I'll come back to that and give you a little bit of detail on it. Educate, train, entertain and communicate messages, and it's used in lots and lots of healthcare settings. That's where most of the research literature comes from, the field of medicine, field of nursing, etc., etc. And there's a good basis for using storytelling in terms of getting case histories and stuff like that, and some interesting information about using them rather than the formal assessment tools that Mark talked about this morning, like inventories and such like, where you're going to score a particular problem or difficulty, that actually getting someone's story can be much more effective. Reminiscence therapy is one example with older people. Life story work, lots of us do that in residential care, trauma and attachment issues, and in terms of building relationships. And there's less documented evidence of how storytelling impacts on practice and the individual. Most of it is about the service user or the recipient of care and how the story impacts on them. It's worth maybe thinking about how storytelling can influence our own practice and what we do. Case histories as a story, and think about the benefits and pros and cons on this. The earlier speakers, some of them talked about the idea of, for instance, case histories and how much actual depth and detail they give us, and the type of information we document and record and the type of information we don't document and record. So case history can present one thing. We've all had the experience of getting a file in and looking at it and going, not sure about this, maybe not a good fit for this setting, maybe they shouldn't be referred to us, maybe, there's some other context, this is never going to work out, 5 failed placements in the last, X amount of time. And when you look at that, you speak to the person and hear their story, and you go, whoa, that's completely different. There's a context. Share their personal experience, accounts of lived experience, and we talk about that from the point of view of advocacy, and maybe people having a legitimate perspective from an advocacy point of view. The lived experience, what was it like for you to be there? What your experience means, it allows you to articulate that, and navigate the pathway between what policies and procedures say people should do and the actual nature of their role. If you look at the whole idea of what Mark was talking about earlier, in terms of defining what we do, stories usually allow us to define what we do and articulate it in some way. And in social care, to a fairly significant degree, I think we define our profession in terms of what we don't, the things we aren't. So we're like social workers, but we're not social workers. In many ways, it's a sort of a relationship there where we say, well, I can tell you something that's related to it and then tell you we're not that, and that's maybe a way of articulating what we do. So the actual nature of our role, you can say, well, what I do is, here's the story of my day, here's the story of a service user I work with. And over lunch, loads of people have been telling stories of service users they worked with and experiences they've had. We can see the emotional impact of decisions that we make and the acts that we have through a story. Someone tells you about their story of being in a service. We may have achieved what was needed, but through storytelling we discover additional needs or stressors. We get a more in-depth picture, essentially. So the idea is, again, about outcomes. You might have gotten to the outcome that you wanted, or at least perceived yourself to have gotten to the outcome you wanted. But were there missed opportunities, or are there other issues which still need to be addressed that the story would tell us more accurately? And the idea is of stories as being fluid and ever-changing. And you look at this again, I see this with practice examples where I'm talking to students about practice examples from years ago in particular. And I actually wonder to myself, is that the way that thing happened? Or have I just kind of constructed it over the years as I repeatedly use the example and different students have different input into it? Have I changed it in my mind to fit more with what I want to explain? And am I missing out on some of the technical fact in favour of the story providing some depth or detail that's important? So we can use stories as a really fluid tool. Hardy talks about the idea of empathy, and particularly crucial in relation to cultural diversity. Well, if we look again at some of the presentations over the course of the day today, and if we look at some of the issues we have about people coming into Ireland from different countries and different ethnic backgrounds, and the challenges we have, understanding someone's experience, we can build that really, really quickly and easily through storytelling. Again, Emmett suggests that storytelling allows for cultural inculcation, the idea of getting embedded in a culture, and storytelling is a fairly significant part of Irish culture. It's pretty easy to see how we buy into a storytelling mechanism, and we can see there's some nice research on the Somali tradition of storytelling as well, which buys into this same idea. We can get a new perspective, something we've not considered before as a result of using stories and seeing how stories work, and reflecting our own moral compass. Back to the point this morning about why we do the things we do rather than what we actually did, and we can figure out what's driving our behaviour in various different settings. Look at our own values. Storytelling, if we give students love these case studies which again have a story embedded in them of a particular experience, and we can look at that and say map it out for them, and the student goes, okay, well, they always want more and more detail of the story, more depth to it, what happened and what were the surrounding factors. And it's often something, a case study I've just written and made up myself. There is no truth to it in real terms, but they want to figure out what exactly happened in the story, and they want to know what the end point was. That person, if you tell a story, particularly to students, of a particular set of events, and then I just leave it and go, and that's where it was, and then they go, well, what happened to him? Where did he end up? What did he do? Was he okay now? Do you ever see him? Indicate the differences and similarities between people's beliefs and assumptions, so we can tie it into an experience someone's had and what they've processed as a result of that. I think that's pretty straightforward. Our own piece of research to talk briefly about this in terms of storytelling. We looked at the use and perceived value of storytelling both in practice and in education. So we looked at a couple of different samples, and we administered a number of questionnaires to social care practitioners and to students, looking in really simple terms about the type of stories they told, the extent to which they used storytelling within their practice, and with students the type of stories that had an impact on them. And we look at a couple of points around that. We had 6 closed questions relating to the use of informal storytelling and the impact and perceived obstacles associated with this. And we had an open question where we asked them to recount a story. which had an impact on them in some way or which they'd used to develop. This was really interesting, and possibly the more interesting part of the research was the open question. People really, really struggled to document a story. And maybe some of it was about the wording of the question that we put down. And many of them wrote down, I have a really good story about a time that in a service we had to resolve an issue around challenging behaviour. And they didn't tell us the story. So it may be about wording of the question, or maybe it's about actually articulating the story. Often in written terms can be quite challenging, and to put it down on paper and document it, particularly in the little box we had, which was relatively short, that they simply told us, well, yeah, I have a good story. So we were kind of in the position that students are sometimes in of looking at it and going, well, why don't you tell us it? Give us the information, give us the depth and the detail around this. The types of stories people use. Broadly speaking, we were able to split the stories into two types of story which were used from a practitioner point of view. Personal stories from their own life, and some examples of this might be where someone had made some significant change in health terms, maybe like losing a lot of weight or taking up a new exercise or taking up a new hobby or pastime, so something personal to them. Maybe some experience they've had, like experiencing bullying or experiencing some negative life event that they felt it was useful to talk to service users about. And humorous stories, which again in social care, service users seem to really, really engage with. And a huge number of people, 25 out of the 69 respondents, talked about the idea of using humorous stories and how humorous stories were really, really essential. John's written some interesting stuff around this as well, and the use of humour in social care. And if you look to talk about, being able to send a message to someone in a kind of an indirect manner through a humorous story that you might struggle to present to them in a very direct, concrete, honest way, and that we can kind of use stealth to get a message to someone through a humorous story that connects with them and tell them something we want them to hear. Where did they use stories? Lots of people talked about 30 respondents in this case using stories in their day-to-day work. So that's back to this sort of, if you look at the idea of therapeutic use, daily life events, all that sort of material, and you're looking about, as I'm going about my work engaging with service users, I'm able to kind of slowly kind of weave a story into some part of my practice that tells a service user something about myself and some piece of information I want to get across. And about 17 people said that they used stories in key working sessions. So in a much more structured manner, they had some sort of plan to say, okay, here's a story that I might be able to utilise that would be useful in terms of either connection with the service user or some piece of learning that I want them to get. Practice examples. Here's some of the stuff that I just talked about. Encourage behaviour change, engagement with service users, or development of self-concept. So one practitioner talked about the idea of losing some weight, becoming more health conscious, and they wanted to disclose this or talk to the service user about this and what this experience was like for them. Health related issues came up again and again, and conflict resolution, talking about working through a difficult situation with someone and coming to a healthy or a helpful point with regard to that. And in relation to discussion of current issues coming up for young people, so I might talk about when someone comes into a service first, talking about how other people have managed to engage in the service and get through their first couple of weeks in it if it was challenging, or how they navigate the difficulties they might encounter, how they learn to fit in. Humorous stories, over time, allowed the service users to trust me. And again, there's some nice literature written around this idea of humour and trust. If you look at the basic point here being, if I put my humorous story out there, I kind of want a response to it. If it's just to engage with it and laugh and, you have some sort of joke that you put out there, you're hoping that that'll be the response. And the same thing for the young person, that the young person has a level of trust in disclosing something humorous to you and hoping that you'll actually kind of respect that in an appropriate way. Establish connections in relation to relatively safe issues, and the literature and research on this says the same stuff. We get into some dodgy ground where we use humour with more challenging issues, and we have to be kind of structured around where we allow humour to be used. There's definitely some areas where we should think about, communicating in much more direct, clear-cut terms. And there may be scope to extend the use of stories and intervention in relation to more challenging issues. Again, if we think about progression with regard to this, where there's scope for it to go is to use stories in a much more planned fashion and to actually have a bank of stories that we can use in a useful way, and maybe even use in literature, which we see very, very little of in terms of engagement with young people and telling a story or writing a story or articulating a story. Some personal stories people talked about. Service user was having difficulties with their peer group. I explained to them how I came across a situation as a child and how I dealt with it and improved my social skills. And there's lots of issues around boundaries here, as we said, interpretation, understanding and relevance. a concern that came up in terms of the research was around people having a relevant story and actually being able to have a relevant story. I looked myself last night at a number of different stories that I thought I might tell today, and some nice YouTube clips around that. It's very difficult to find something that's relevant to a whole group for any of you, and to have something that's short enough to use in a presentation and snappy enough to get the message across, but at the same time carries enough depth and detail to be worth including. I looked at a really interesting story on Facebook last night of a guy giving his graduation speech essentially in New Zealand. I don't know if anyone else saw it, but he was the senior prefect, voted to be senior prefect in his class the next year, and the senior prefect always gave the graduation speech. And 3 weeks before his speech, he was diagnosed with cancer and a week before his speech, he was diagnosed with cancer and given 3 weeks to live. And he turned up to do his speech and did a really amazing speech about this experience. A kid who's just been diagnosed with a critical illness and is able to do this. Such a powerful story. And you think about, I can't get any of the depth of that across in 30 seconds or 2 minutes here. Okay. Health and well-being, concerns around, say, for instance, medication, and lots of people talked about using, say, a story, for instance, to get a service user to take medication to highlight the importance of being conscious around your health. Relationship issues, parents and romantic relationships. Romantic relationships featured less strongly. I don't know, is it a kind of a confidence or a safety issue around being in a position to disclose personal experiences around that? But if you look at how central it is for young people and the extent to which young people want to talk about these issues, it seems to be an area where we could maybe extend our practice around that. And anxiety, like difficulties in school, social issues and placement issues. And again, these type of stories, there's so much opportunity to develop them. And this is maybe where we saw some practice happening, but where we thought there was significant scope to extend this out. To a lesser degree, we saw evidence of using stories to identify learning, like opening up a discussion, encourage new opportunities, offer alternatives. So where there might be an incident around behaviour or something like that, we can use a story to document something in a kind of an indirect fashion. Professionals talked about using stories to normalise experiences, and we can talk about someone having an experience which to them seems so problematic and so difficult to overcome, and that we can actually put it in context and say, well, actually lots of other people have had this similar experience and have struggled with it and have found a way through it. And we see loads of therapeutic groups which use this basic technique. Look at something like the AA, for instance, where people come in and effectively tell their story, and as they tell their story, other people in the group come to believe that, well, yeah, there's possible to get progress here. Deflect from issues or handle trigger times, something like using humour, for instance, to diffuse a situation, to take the tension out of it, to connect a young person back to where we want them to go, and to develop a connection between staff and service users, develop relationships between service users themselves. That point is really, again, something aspirational in terms of, on two levels we looked at this. The stories which students talked about having an impact on them were almost exclusively stories from lecturers to students. And we thought maybe students' own stories between themselves might have some significance. So we used tutorials a lot and people go on placement. And we thought maybe students would come back and tell each other a story from practice, and that they would remember that and it would have an impact on them. But it didn't show up in the research at all. And maybe it's something to do with authority and where the story comes from. But our stories seem to have much more significance for them, sadly. The other point is around in intervention terms for practitioners. If we think about the idea of getting young people to tell their stories to each other, kind of a big brother, big sister type role, and that we can get peer-based intervention. In this regard, there's such a big opportunity there for people to document their experiences and talk through and use stories to intervene with their peer group and to contribute to effective group functioning, group dynamics, healthy engagement. Personal storytelling, it gives us our own self-understanding, so we can look at the idea of the stories I tell as being significant about the things I think are important and the stuff that I prioritise in terms of work and training and education. Reframing of our identity and encourages our personal growth. So again, in terms of the stories we tell, the students talk to us about the idea of going on placement and kind of having a fresh start, being able to go into this agency and not having any history there, and you can reframe yourself for 12 or 13 or 14 weeks and try out some strategies around that. Significant events in their own words in their own time, and allows them to reflect on their experience, and it can be upsetting, but it's believed to be cathartic. So this idea of storytelling as catharsis, that loads and loads of people have a story within them that they want to get out, Maybe it's a significant life event, maybe it's a traumatic experience, maybe it's something that was challenging for them, but that they have something they want to articulate and that we need to give them an opportunity to do that, whether that's in written form or oral form or in a structured setting like a key working session or in an unstructured fashion at some point throughout our engagement with them. Important in practice for both staff and service users. And that catharsis, the same catharsis happens for staff. You can see at handover, you can see in supervision, you can see in a whole load of different settings where we have people who want to tell their story of working in practice and the difficulties and challenges that they encounter. Some obstacles that I'll touch on and look briefly at around the effective use of storytelling, and some do come up, and it's really just a matter of being mindful of the challenges rather than seeing them as being insurmountable in any way. The research, in terms of our specific research, the things that people highlighted, the first one was misuse of information, and it's an interesting starting point. Practitioners identified the idea of being fearful that their information, if they disclose something personal, that effectively the service user might throw it back at them in some way in future that was damaging or hurtful. And I suppose a response to that is maybe that's about coming to terms with our own information, and that if we're comfortable with it, it can't really be misused against us. You know, and that if we come to a point where I'm comfortable with my experiences, I mean comfortable in terms of disclosing them, that really it shouldn't be something that's a big risk factor in terms of this being used against me in some way. But it was a concern that came up. Having the absence of a story where people felt that they wanted to connect with something like a difficult issue that a young person was having, that they wanted to empathise with them, and they simply didn't have something to say. And that's a big challenge, and I don't know what the answer to that is. In terms of empathy and empathising with some of the situations we encounter, I think it's remarkably difficult. And maybe we encounter situations where if we could genuinely empathise with a young person in terms of the experience we're having, we would really, really struggle to manage in the moment ourselves and to contain ourselves in a what we'd perceived to be a professional fashion. Lack of understanding. Interestingly enough, from the students' point of view, they didn't feel they encountered a lot of stories where they didn't understand what was being put across them. They all took a certain meaning from the stories they encountered. But practitioners had a concern that they used stories with young people and that the young person simply didn't get the message. Now, if you go back to Bettelheim's work, Bettelheim talks about the retelling of fairy tales in order to allow meaning to become embedded. And that often, and you see this with children and young people, children get attached to a story and they like to hear the story repeatedly. And they often actually want, they're answering the words as you're reading them the story. And if you, God forbid, you would leave out a page, you'd try and skip one and they'll catch you out on it and bring you back to say, that's not the way it goes. The story is different. So from that point of view, maybe that lack of understanding isn't quite as significant as we might think. Lack of interest was a concern, again, from the point of the practitioners thought that maybe their stories weren't interesting or engaging enough, and inappropriate disclosure was a fairly significant concern. They felt that you were getting into this area that Mark mentioned earlier about kind of unstructured ground, and that if I start telling my personal stories, I don't have the same boundaries that I have if I'm using the kind of therapeutic techniques that we're taught in college and in training, like if I'm using a CBT-based approach or something like that, I almost have a workbook that I can work from. Whereas if I'm telling my personal stories, that maybe I'll drift into disclosing something about my children, about where I live, about my personal experiences, and that this can get dangerous. And surely on the flip side of that, that's the essence of relationship building, is being willing to engage with the information and put it out there and manage it appropriately. Some theoretical stuff. Gaidos talks about these 4 processes that we move through, and it's a nice idea. It's very, very straightforward around storytelling. And he says the first thing is engagement. We switch on with each other and we get connected in some sort of way. Mutuality is the next phase of that. It's where we come to some sort of shared understanding. Movement is I maybe begin to develop my own individual understanding of it. And then this new form is, and this happens reasonably regularly, where someone moves away with their new version of events of a new story. And I find this a little bit of a struggle in college, where I use a practice example and what someone takes from it is entirely different to what I intended they would take from it. So they walk away with a different understanding entirely to what I wanted them to. But the important thing is that they have their own understanding. They've processed in some way this information. And Gaidos talks about the idea of both parties agreeing to nurture trust, respect, care and empathy, and we get some sort of reflection. And this new meaning is essentially what we get to, the new form, the new meaning around that. Some pitfalls. Tied into the obstacles and challenges. Stories should be used to give voice, but allow for contrasting voices to be heard rather than the main ones. There's a danger with this approach that we get some sort of domination by people who are maybe in a stronger position to tell their story. So if you think about within a service user group, we can hear the same stories repeatedly, maybe that are relatively easy to access, and we struggle to bring out the other voices, and that, individual service users who we would really want to see tell their story don't get the opportunity to do that simply because there's a dominant voice. Is this allowing for the development of service user-based practice? Does it give us scope to do this? Well, it should if we're doing it effectively. If we're not getting a full kind of perspective from the service user's point of view, then maybe we don't really get service user-based practice. We get it based on one individual's experience. Consideration of the ethics of who owns the story and the links with the fear practitioners often have of their misuse, and the reality versus fantasy point I made earlier. Who owns the story is an interesting point. Do you lose ownership of your story if you share it with a service user? Are they allowed to go and do what they want with it from that point of view? And far, far more pressingly, think about it from a young person's point of view. When they share their story with you, do they lose ownership of it, and can I go and do what I want with it as I document it in my case notes or in my daily handover or log or whatever else? Service users have the exact same fear about disclosing their stories and misuse of their information, and if I tell you something significant, will you understand it and engage with it? Should be aware of the need to, and the ability to empathise with certain parts or omit certain parts, emphasise I should say, on what this tells you. That's about the information that's not disclosed or that's disregarded in some way. Within the educational spectrum, just a couple of points on this. The newly qualified practitioners or soon to be qualified practitioners, we thought this was a useful tool. It could have quite a big impact on people who in educational settings, and could we develop understanding but also encourage the use of storytelling as a tool? Well, what we want to do was illustrate the use of storytelling with the intention that people would go out working in practice and do it themselves, that we would effectively role model this. Training, leadership and guidance you can provide to your own staff or the service users you're working with. This is really just something to think about. I'm mostly talking about storytelling between staff and service users, but within our staff team, can we use storytelling in terms of supervision? Can we use storytelling in terms of debriefs? Can we use storytelling in an effective way as a conflict resolution between staff? All the exact same stuff as we might do with service users. Similarities and differences between storytelling in education and practice, and some of the challenges. Case studies as a story, we use this a lot in terms of problem-based learning and in terms of education. We can do something similar in practice around this. Realistic, complex and contextually rich situations that involve some sort of dilemma, conflict or problem that some of the characters in the case study must negotiate. And again, that ties back to Bettelheim's work on fairy tales, and you'll often see in a fairy tale some journey a person has to go through. They have to navigate some difficult challenge and come out the other side. Bridge the gap between theory and practice and between the academy and the workplace, and that's tying to Mark's earlier point about academic theory and technical information versus maybe the reality of practice, and whether or not we can use a story to turn a theory into something that's a little bit more easy to understand. A form of assessment or problem-based learning in individual and in group work, well, it's pretty straightforward to see how we might be able to do that. Within the educational context, 32 out of 34 students felt that they often encountered stories, so it's very, very commonly used in an informal manner. They said all sorts of stories are used by lecturers: humorous, personal stories, case studies and professional practice stories. They were useful to extend their learning. They wanted more of this. They felt strongly this was good, useful learning for them. And they said they were used very effectively to address things like ethical issues and to develop their own self-concept. In terms of ethical issues, telling a story was an interesting way or a useful way to engage with something quite challenging. To discuss self-care and health issues and issues around peer and conflict resolution. So again, similar to the practitioners, they found the same type of issues coming up and being resolved. Again, same type of obstacles: inappropriate disclosure, misuse of information and absence of a suitable story were some of the challenges that came up. Students didn't ever highlight that they encountered disinteresting stories. They liked them across the board and they valued and understood them, and they valued real-life documented practice stories in particular. And they talked about things like using television documentaries where someone told their story, using social media in relation to stories, real-life experiences, innovative practice and alternative ways to deal with issues, and teaching people about how to deal with issues or conflict in social care practice. So all similar stuff that kind of just underlies the value of storytelling as a mechanism for training as well as for connection and relationship building. What should we be doing as a result of this? Well, we should be noting the value of stories, firstly, in the first instance. One point to note, which is of significance, and I don't know exactly how this might parallel to the service user-based context, is that students almost always documented stories they encountered in first year. And it seems they were most open to kind of stories at this point. Maybe they become a little bit more cynical as they move to second and third year and don't believe our stories with the same amount of depth and detail. But in first year, they seem to have the most impact on them. Maybe it's like looking for understanding and learning. So maybe something similar happens with service users or young people when they come into a service. I don't know about that. Need to be aware of the challenges and difficulties around interpretation, which I think I've probably talked enough about. And they didn't highlight stories from other students. As I said, we seem to be missing the peer-based learning component of it. We seem to have the transfer from, the professional through to the academic through to the student, but not from peer to peer. Scope for use of storytelling across lots of different modules, and stories from new voices carry particular weight. I was just talking to Morris about having Peter McVerry launch his book last night, and we've had Peter McVerry come in and speak to the students. And 4 years on, students will tell you almost to the word the exact things that Peter McVerry said in his speech and tell you the stories that Peter McVerry told. And sometimes a new voice can carry very significant weight in that regard. And maybe there's an opportunity within practice settings to bring in a new voice both for staff teams and for service users. Some points around research and where we might go. The last point is maybe the most significant one around topics considered safe and unsafe in the context of personal stories, and whether there's scope for us to take some risks around this and think about the type of stories we might be comfortable telling and not comfortable telling. Allow people to see, service users to see the real side of you as a practitioner and maybe glimpse a little bit more of your whole self. And they definitely allow for this development of empathy. And as we hear and see someone's story, we get a much, much bigger picture rather than what we might pick from a case file or from a referral. Some limitations: coercive nature of storytelling and the associated risks. The 2 points in this. The first point around the coercive nature is at a group level, we can definitely see the danger of some momentum gathering around storytelling, and I've seen this in group disclosure where someone tells their story and other people maybe are pushed to do something they're not comfortable with in terms of sharing a personal story. Stories often focus on exceptional cases. The ones that stick in our mind are maybe the exceptional cases, and that loses some of the value in that. Maybe there's value in the more day-to-day mundane stories, for want of a better word. And language, culture and understanding all need to be considered. They impact fairly significantly on stories, and in terms of culture and understanding, that's a real challenge. Where can we do it a little bit more? Think about assessment tools based on stories, care planning systems, key working sessions, peer-based intervention I've talked quite a bit about, and at a group level, do we use storytelling formally at a group level? In general terms, the research we have so far suggested that people did this in one-to-one much more comfortably. Could we structure it at a group level and have group engagement with storytelling as a possible methodology? People telling their own stories and learning from their own stories kind of as a reflective practice component or as an element of reflection. And service user story has been key to development of the service user's voice. If you look at the whole component of trying to centralise the service user's voice, at the moment we don't do that terribly effectively, and it's pretty challenging to get the service user's voice as a central component within the systems we have. Maybe storytelling allows us to do this. Should we use formal storytelling to a greater degree? Stories of storytelling among staff, which I just mentioned, supervision, handover, and gender differences in relation to the utilisation of stories from a staff and service user perspective. Maybe that's just something to reflect on as to whether or not stories are, context have different significance based on gender, and whether or not both the source and the recipient of the story, whether we need to consider gender as an issue. Final points on it. Person-centred approach is helped by this, and seeing people's whole lives is definitely a possibility around this. We can get someone's perspective clearly on this through using storytelling. There's a whole load of advantages attached to it around management of behaviour. Some of the research suggesting that we need formal structures to help this happen. We can't just depend on it being done informally, and that actually we can develop it, create outcome-focused thinking and action, and retain an awareness of the pitfalls. And one of the pitfalls from a quote from within our research says, I use storytelling all the time, so much so that one service user recently asked that I be assigned to him today, but I not talk. So maybe service users can grow tiresome of our stories and wear it a little bit thin over time. And here's a quote from Kipling to finish. If history were taught in the form of stories, it would never be forgotten. And maybe in the context of social care in Ireland, there's quite a lot from history that we need to learn from and ensure that we don't forget and that there's some opportunities for reflection there. Okay, folks, thanks very much.